You are not stuck because you lack talent. You are not stuck because the timing is wrong. You are stuck because something invisible is running a program inside your head that you have never been able to see clearly enough to shut down. Most people spend their entire lives working harder, grinding longer, pushing more, and still wondering why they never fully break through. The answer is not effort. The answer is fear. Not the fear you can name, the four fears you cannot. The ones hiding behind your habits, your hesitation, your silence, and your most comfortable excuses. The ones that are draining your momentum right now, today, while you convince yourself you are simply being realistic. He was the most dangerous man alive. 77 kills, 3 days. A body count that made the most powerful crime organization in New York collapse like a building with no foundation. He moved through rooms full of armed men the way a storm moves through empty fields, without hesitation, without doubt, without a single wasted second of indecision. This is the man the entire criminal underworld called the boogeyman's boogeyman. This is the man Viggo Tarasov described with a shaking voice to his own son, the son who started all of it, as someone who once killed 3 men in a bar with a pencil. A pencil. And yet, before any of that, before the basement, before the suit, before the first body hit the floor of the Red Circle nightclub, there was a moment, a single, quiet, devastating moment in John Wick's life when all of that capability, all of that focused, extraordinary, impossible skill was doing absolutely nothing. It was sitting in a quiet house with a dead dog and a stolen car and the memory of a woman he could not save. And in that moment, the most lethal human being in fiction was paralyzed. Not by bullets, not by armies, not by the high table or the marquis or the entire underworld marshaling against him, by fear. The kind you cannot shoot, the kind that wears the face of grief, of caution, of realism, of patience. The kind that whispers reasonable-sounding things while quietly burning everything you were about to build. That moment, that exact moment, is where this story begins. Before we go any further, if this already sounds like something you needed to hear today, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the bell. What we do here every single week is exactly this: the psychology underneath the story, the lesson underneath the lesson. Subscribe, and let's go deeper. Before Iosef Tarasov broke into his house, John Wick had done something that almost nobody in his world had ever managed to do. He had walked away. He had completed what Viggo Tarasov called the impossible task, killing all of his enemies in a single night. And in doing so, he had earned the right to leave, to retire, to be something other than the thing he had been trained to be since before he was old enough to choose. He had found Helen, and he had built a life around her. Not a perfect life, not a comfortable life by the standards of people who have never held grief like a stone in their chest, but a real one. A man and a woman and a house and a car and the specific, fragile, irreplaceable peace of mornings when nobody is trying to kill you. And then Helen got sick. And then Helen died. And in the days after, something happens to John Wick that the film shows with extraordinary quiet honesty. He does not spring into action. He does not immediately become the legend again. He sits in that house. He watches her videos on a tablet. He barely eats. He moves through the days like a man who has forgotten what the days are for. Clinical psychologist Dr. Drea Letamendi, who analyzed the John Wick character in depth, described this state precisely. She noted that John's early morning drives, the reckless speed, the sharp turns on the empty airport runway, were what psychologists call an adrenaline dump, a way for a depressed, understimulated brain to feel alive again, not strength, a symptom. The behavior of someone who has lost their anchor and is reaching for anything that creates sensation to replace the numbness. This is the first thing you need to understand about fear. The most dangerous fears do not announce themselves as fear. They show up wearing the clothes of grief, of caution, of being realistic, of simply not being ready yet. They are indistinguishable from sensible behavior until you look closely enough to see what they are actually preventing. And then the puppy arrives, sent by Helen before she died. A note with it saying she wanted him to have something to love while he learned to live again. And for 3 days, exactly 3 days, John Wick lets something small and warm and alive break through the armor of his numbness and start to matter. 3 days. Iosef Tarasov, 20 years old, the son of a man who built an empire on the fear of other people, walks into John's house that night with his friends. They want the car. They take it. And on their way out, they kill the dog. Not because they had to, but because they could. Because to Iosef, who had never once been forced to understand the weight of what he was doing, the dog was an inconvenience, a noise, an obstacle. What Iosef Tarasov did not understand, what his father understood with perfect clarity the second the call came in, was that he had not just stolen a car and killed a dog. He had removed the last thing standing between the world and John Wick. He had cleared the last obstacle between a man and the full, unbounded, unfiltered expression of what that man actually was. And what happens next is not the story of revenge, not really. What happens next is the story of what a human being becomes when every single one of their fears is stripped away in a single night. Because here is the truth that the first John Wick film is built on. John Wick was not powerful in spite of losing everything. He was powerful because of it. The loss removed the fear of loss, and the fear of loss, that specific, invisible, suffocating fear, is the first and most fundamental fear that is sabotaging your momentum right now. There is a concept in psychology that researchers call the endowment effect. It was first described in detail by Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist Richard Thaler in 1980. And what his research consistently found was this: human beings value what they already have approximately twice as much as an identical thing they do not yet own. We are not rational about possession. We are deeply, irrationally attached to what is already in our hands, even when holding it is costing us everything. The fear of losing what you already have is not really about the thing you have. It is about the identity you have built around it. The job you stay in because leaving would mean admitting that the 10 years you spent there were not the best use of your decade. The relationship you don't fully leave and don't fully commit to because both options feel like loss. The creative project you never finish because finished means it can be judged, and right now it is still protected by being incomplete. Gavin de Becker wrote in his 1997 book, The Gift of Fear, a book built on decades of studying human threat response, that the most paralyzing fear is not the fear of something specific happening to us. It is the unformed ambient fear of potential loss, of the undefined bad thing that might happen if we move. This ambient fear, he argued, is what keeps human beings frozen in circumstances that are actively harming them, because the brain cannot perform a cost-benefit analysis on a threat it has not clearly defined. And so it defaults to stillness. It defaults to the thing it already knows, even when the thing it already knows is quietly destroying you. John Wick, in the years before the film begins, was living inside this fear without being able to name it. He had the quiet life. He had the house. He had the car. He had Helen. And somewhere beneath the surface of all of it, in the same place where every person who has ever traded their full capability for comfort knows to look, there was the constant, low-frequency anxiety of someone who is always one moment away from losing the thing they built their peace around. That fear made him small, not in skill, in scope. He had gone from a man who operated on the full spectrum of what he was capable of to a man who was managing the perimeter of what he was afraid to lose. And the gap between those two states, the gap between your full range and the range you allow yourself because you are protecting something, that gap is where your momentum goes to die. Think about what John does the moment the loss is complete, the moment the dog is gone and the house is quiet and there is nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose. He does not hesitate. He does not second guess. He goes to the basement, breaks the concrete, and takes out everything he buried. He is not becoming something new. He is becoming something old, something true, something that the fear of loss had been successfully suppressing for years. That is the first hidden fear, the fear of losing what you already have. And the way it destroys momentum is not through dramatic catastrophe. It is through the steady, daily compression of your operating range until the version of you that shows up in the world is a carefully managed, strategically limited, fear-edited version of what you actually are. John Wick broke through the concrete floor. The question is, what is your concrete floor? What is the thing you poured over the version of yourself that is too risky, too loud, too fully committed to keep around when you have something comfortable to protect? And when are you going to break through it? Gay Hendricks, in his 2009 book, The Big Leap, identified what he called the upper limit problem, the psychological mechanism by which human beings unconsciously sabotage their own momentum the moment they approach the ceiling of what they believe they deserve. He documented case after case of people who had everything in place for a breakthrough, who had done everything right, who were days or weeks away from crossing a threshold, and who, at that exact moment, manufactured a crisis, picked a fight, got sick, lost focus, made a mistake that should have been impossible to make. Not because they were self-destructive, because the brain, wired by years of operating at a particular level of success and comfort, treats the next level as a threat, as a loss of the known. And it triggers the endowment effect, the attachment to what you already have, and quietly, without your permission, pulls you back down to what feels safe. John Wick did not have the luxury of an upper limit problem. Fate removed the ceiling by removing everything beneath it. And in that terrible, involuntary freedom, he moved. When John Wick walks into the Red Circle nightclub, something happens in that building that is not about fighting skill. It is about presence. It is about a man who is completely visible, not performing visibility, not managing how he is perceived, not strategically calibrating his self-presentation, but simply, entirely, undefendedly himself. And every single person in that building can feel it. The bouncer at the door can feel it. The men on the floor can feel it. Viggo Tarasov, watching through whatever surveillance feeds he has access to, can feel it from the other side of the city. There is something about a person who has completely stopped caring about how they appear that is one of the most powerful and most terrifying things a human being can project. And almost nobody does it voluntarily, because the second hidden fear, the fear of being seen, is one of the most sophisticated and most successful saboteurs of human momentum that has ever existed. Not because it prevents you from acting, but because it makes you act as a slightly reduced, slightly cautious, slightly performance-aware version of yourself at all times, in every room, on every call, in every piece of work you put into the world. Brené Brown spent more than a decade studying vulnerability and shame at the University of Houston. Her research, detailed in her 2010 book, Daring Greatly, found that the single most consistent factor separating people who were living and working at full capacity from those who were not was not skill, not intelligence, not resources, and not opportunity. It was their relationship with visibility, their willingness to be seen fully, not just the polished, successful, managed version of themselves, but the whole thing, the uncertainty, the work in progress, the parts that were not yet finished, the parts that might be judged. She found that the fear of vulnerability, the fear of being seen in an unfinished, imperfect, or uncertain state, was directly correlated with creative suppression, professional stagnation, and the specific kind of low-grade chronic dissatisfaction that comes from living at 60% of your actual capacity because the other 40% feels too exposed to deploy. You defer decisions, reject praise, or hide your own voice, not because you don't have the skill, but because you're afraid success will shine a spotlight you don't feel ready for. That sentence describes a behavior pattern that is almost universal among people with genuine capability. The fear is not of failure. The fear is of being fully seen and then judged, compared, found wanting, or held to a new standard you are not certain you can maintain. The marker scene in Chapter 2 is about more than a debt. It is about the impossibility of hiding. John had done everything right. He had paid the price for his freedom. He had buried the weapons in the concrete floor. He had built a house in a neighborhood where nobody would look for the boogeyman. He had tried with everything he had to make himself small enough to disappear. But you cannot bury what you are. You can only delay it. For some, this fear may be rooted in past experiences, perhaps a time when success was followed by punishment, rejection, or overwhelming pressure. Unconsciously, they learn to associate achievement with pain and instinctively avoid replicating that dynamic. John Wick's entire pre-film history is this dynamic made literal. He was born Jardani Jovanovic, an orphan raised inside the Ruska Roma, trained as an instrument. His visibility, his entire identity, was a liability from the beginning. Being seen meant being used. Being known meant being owned. The reasonable, rational, self-protective response to that kind of origin is to make yourself as invisible as possible the moment you get the chance. And so he tried, and for a while it worked, until Santino knocked on the door with proof that it never had. The fear of being seen does not just suppress your visibility, it suppresses your range. It makes you test your work privately, but never publish it. It makes you prepare a presentation endlessly, but delay the meeting. It makes you have the idea completely, but present only a version of it. It makes you speak, but slightly less loudly than you actually think. It makes you lead, but slightly less decisively than you actually know how. Fear narrows perception. Instead of seeing possibilities, the mind focuses on potential threats. This explains why fear affects decision-making so strongly. The brain's goal becomes emotional safety rather than growth or success. And here is the most insidious part of this fear. The people who manage it best, the ones who appear most functional on the outside, are often being destroyed most thoroughly on the inside because they are highly skilled at performing visibility without experiencing it. They show up, they deliver, they even receive praise, but they are always slightly behind the glass, always slightly separated from what they are doing by the thin, constant, exhausting layer of self-monitoring. John Wick, after the marker forces him back into the world, makes a decision that the film never states explicitly, but shows with absolute precision in every scene from Rome forward. He stops managing how he appears. He stops performing anything. He becomes exactly what he is, completely, without apology, without strategic self-presentation. And in doing so, he becomes something that even a bullet cannot fully stop. Brené Brown writes in Daring Greatly, "Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome." John Wick, walking into the catacombs beneath Rome with Santino's men already in position to kill him, had no control over the outcome. He showed up anyway, completely, as exactly what he was, and what he was turned out to be more than enough. If this is already hitting differently than you expected when you clicked, If you are recognizing something in this that you have been carrying for a long time, please like this video right now. One tap. It costs you nothing, and it tells me to keep making content that goes this deep. Thank you. Now let's keep going, because the next two fears are the ones most people never see coming at all. When John Wick kills Santino in the Continental and is declared excommunicado, when the $14 million bounty goes active and every resource, every contact, every favor, every safe harbor in the underworld is stripped from him simultaneously. Something happens in his body that is worth watching very closely. He walks out of the Continental. He does not run. He does not panic. He does not stand in the middle of the street processing the magnitude of what he has just lost. He walks into a city that is already starting to turn against him, with nothing, no allies, no plan, no safety net, no certainty of anything except the next 10 seconds. He walks, and what he walks into is the third and most secretly paralyzing of all hidden fears. The fear of starting over, of losing the ground you have already gained, of having to rebuild from zero when you have already climbed so far from where you started. This fear is extraordinarily powerful because it is disguised as wisdom. It sounds like experience talking, like earned perspective, like the reasonable caution of someone who has already paid high prices and knows better than to risk losing it all. But underneath the reasonable-sounding voice is pure, biological, self-protective terror. The same terror that neuroimaging studies have found is linked directly to procrastination. Neuroimaging studies have shown that chronic procrastinators have larger amygdalas, the brain's alarm system, and weaker connections between the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex, which helps control impulsive behavior. This biological reality explains why willpower alone rarely conquers procrastination. The brain does not distinguish between the threat of physical danger and the threat of loss. Both activate the amygdala. Both trigger the same fight, flight, or freeze cascade. Both flood the body with the same cortisol, the same adrenaline, or same primal instruction to stop, to not move, to protect what you have from the risk of the next step. And so people stay in the job that is draining them, in the version of their work that they have already mastered, but that stopped growing 2 years ago, in the relationship that has become comfortable in the way that a coffin is comfortable. Not because they are happy, because the brain has calculated that the known loss of staying is less threatening than the unknown cost of going. 1 hour. That is what he has when Chapter 3 opens. 60 minutes before everything becomes official. And what he does with that hour is not what most people would do with an hour in which the ground beneath them is disappearing. He goes to a library. He does not run blindly. He does not spend the hour in paralysis or in rage or in grief for what he has just lost. He goes to retrieve something he needs, something specific. He moves with complete tactical present tense focus on what is possible right now with what he currently has, not what he used to have, not what he lost when the excommunicado went live, not the world he knew 45 minutes ago. What is available right now? Steven Pressfield, in his 2002 book, The War of Art, one of the most honest examinations ever written of what prevents human beings from doing their best work, described this as resistance with a capital R. He wrote that resistance is the force that stands between a human being and their most important work, and that it is uniquely and specifically most powerful at the beginning of a new attempt, not in the middle, not near the end, at the moment of starting again. The more important a call or action is to our soul's evolution, Pressfield wrote, the more resistance we will feel toward pursuing it. Starting over is not actually dangerous. It only feels dangerous because the brain, which has been through the cost of building what you built, cannot accurately calculate the cost of losing it compared to the cost of rebuilding. So it defaults to avoidance. It invents reasons to wait. It manufactures a feeling of unreadiness that has nothing to do with your actual readiness and everything to do with the amygdala's terror of sunk costs. John Wick has sunk costs that most human beings cannot imagine. Not just the career he left, not just the years he spent in the underworld, his wife, his home, his dog, his freedom, his name, his reputation, his entire architecture of safety. All of it, layer by layer, stripped until Chapter 3 opens with nothing left but the man himself. And he runs through the rain, and he goes to the library, and he retrieves the one thing he needs, and he begins. Again, watch what he does with the weapons in that bazaar. He has never used these specific tools before. The environment is not one he prepared for. Nothing about his current situation matches the conditions he spent years training for. And his performance does not drop by a single degree. Because this is the truth that the fear of starting over never tells you. You do not start from zero. You start from experience. From a body that has learned things at a cellular level that it does not forget just because the external circumstances have changed. From a mind that carries every lesson, every failure, every moment of building anything, even things that were eventually destroyed. Growth always involves uncertainty. Learning to accept uncertainty reduces the impact of fear of change and fear of the unknown. Life rarely provides perfect clarity before action. Often, clarity appears after action. John Wick never waits for clarity before moving. He moves, and the moving produces the clarity. The next position reveals the next possibility that could not have been seen from the previous one. This is not recklessness. This is the only strategy that has ever produced forward motion in conditions of radical uncertainty. What are you waiting to start over on? What is the thing you have been approaching from the position of someone protecting everything they have already built, when the truth is that what you have already built is not protecting you, it is containing you? What would you attempt if you genuinely believed that starting over did not mean starting from zero? The fear of starting over is one of the most effective momentum killers that exists because it manufactures the feeling of loss before any actual loss has occurred. It makes you feel the devastation of starting again as though it has already happened, as though the ground has already been lost, when the ground has not moved at all. The only thing that has moved is your imagination into a catastrophic future that has not been written yet. John Wick walked out of the Continental with nothing and started moving. The question is not whether you can afford to start over. The question is whether you can afford to keep not starting. He lands. He survives the fall because the tactical suit, the same one he has worn across all 4 films, absorbs enough to preserve him. But that is not the point of this scene. The point is not the survival. The point is the betrayal. Winston, the man who has been John's most consistent point of contact with sanity inside the world that would otherwise consume him entirely, made a calculation. John was the variable that needed to be removed to preserve the Continental, to preserve Winston's position, to restore the balance that the high table required. And so Winston removed him, with a gun, from the roof. And now John is on the ground with a bullet wound and a body that has just fallen several stories, and a world that has just demonstrated, with perfect finality, that even the people you trusted with the version of yourself you almost let be seen, even they will sacrifice you when the calculation changes. And this is the 4th fear, the deepest one, the one that nobody talks about because it is the most shameful to admit, the fear that you are the problem, not the circumstances, not the people around you, not the system, not the timing. You. That the reason things keep going wrong, that the reason the momentum keeps breaking, that the reason the next level stays just out of reach is something fundamental to who you are that you cannot fix and cannot outrun. At the heart of this struggle is the internalization of critical voices, those of the demanding parent, the shaming teacher, the cruel peer. Over time, these voices don't fade. They become internal narrators, forming the basis of the superego, the harsh inner authority that polices the self. For those caught in this fear, the superego never applauds. It only moves the goalpost. That internal narrator, that voice, you know it. You have heard it every time something went wrong, and the first thing you did, before you even finished processing what happened, was start a sentence that began with, "Because I always," or "Because I never," or "Because I'm the kind of person who." That voice is the fourth fear in its most advanced, most embedded, most destructive form. Psychologists call this attribution style, the tendency to attribute negative outcomes to stable, global, internal causes, meaning causes that are permanent, that affect everything, and that are fundamentally about who you are, rather than to specific, temporary, external factors. The research on attribution style consistently shows that people who default to internal permanent attribution after setbacks have dramatically higher rates of depression, anxiety, and, critically for our purposes, dramatically lower rates of persistent effort after failure. Not because they are less capable, because the story they are telling themselves about what the failure means is more debilitating than the failure itself. Are you pissed off? Yeah. That exchange is two words that contain the entire architecture of how a person who has internalized the fourth fear, the fear that they are the problem, chooses not to let that fear be the last word. Notice what John does not say. He does not say he is sorry. He does not explain what happened. He does not perform a retrospective analysis of where he went wrong or what it says about him that he is sitting in a basement having been shot off a roof by someone he trusted. He does not apologize for his own existence in the way that people who secretly believe they are the problem always apologize, preemptively, reflexively, for things that are not their fault. He does not spiral. He says, yeah, and they begin to plan. Confidence grows through action, not thinking. Taking small risks gradually reduces fear and self-confidence limitations. Each courageous decision rewires the brain to become more resilient. The neuroscience of this is unambiguous. Each time the brain initiates an action despite the presence of the fear response, each time the prefrontal cortex successfully overrides the amygdala's instruction to freeze, the neural pathway between intention and action is strengthened each time, whether the action succeeds or fails. The strengthening is in the initiation, not the outcome. John Wick, in that basement, having survived being shot off the roof, is not strong because the fall did not hurt him. He is strong because the fall is not the story he is telling himself. Winston's bullet is not evidence that John is the problem. It is evidence that the system is the problem. And those are two entirely different stories with entirely different implications for what happens next. The fear that you are the problem is the most momentum-destroying of all four fears because it attacks the only resource that cannot be replaced from the outside. Your belief in your own ability to change what is in front of you. And once that belief is compromised, once you start carrying the secret conviction that the ceiling is not external, but internal, not circumstantial, but essential, every other tool you possess becomes less effective, because the person deploying the tools has already, quietly, decided that the tools probably won't be enough. The fourth film opens with John rejecting the story, not arguing with it, not appealing it, not requesting a review. He kills the elder. He dismantles the premise that the high table's authority over his life is a fixed, permanent, internal truth about who he is and what he deserves. He treats it as what it actually is, an external system that has been operating on his life with his unconscious permission. and he withdraws that permission. This is the cure for the fourth fear. Not positive thinking, not affirmations, not a morning routine that makes you feel better about the same internal narrative. The cure is the specific, deliberate decision to locate the source of what is limiting you, to look at it squarely and ask whether it is actually a truth about you or a story about you, and then to act as though the story is optional, because it is. Many fears are stored in the subconscious mind. Over time, these experiences create subconscious patterns that influence choices automatically. This is why understanding subconscious fear and behavior is essential for personal transformation. The subconscious pattern is not you. It is a pattern, and patterns, unlike identity, can be interrupted. They can be replaced. They can be acted through until the acting becomes the new pattern and the old story gradually loses its authority. John Wick does not spend Chapter 4 wondering if he deserves freedom. He fights for it with the total commitment of a man who has decided the question is already settled. And that decision, made in the desert, before a single step toward Paris, before the staircase, before the duel, is the moment the fourth fear dies. 222 steps. The Rue Foyatier staircase in Montmartre, one of the most famous staircases in Paris, and in John Wick. Chapter 4, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes the physical, visible, undeniable proof that all four fears, the fear of loss, the fear of being seen, the fear of starting over, the fear of being the problem, can be rendered temporarily irrelevant by a single decision that a human being makes repeatedly in real time with full knowledge of the cost. The decision to get up. He has nothing left to lose on those stairs. He lost that fear in Chapter 1 on the kitchen floor. He is fully, completely visible on those stairs. He abandoned the fear of being seen when Santino burned the house and the excommunicado went live. He is starting over on those stairs, climbing back to zero each time he falls, and doing it without hesitation. That fear died in the library and in the Moroccan bazaar, and the stairs themselves are trying to tell him that he is the problem, that his body is not enough, that the damage is too much, that the fall is the final verdict on what he is capable of. And each time he gets up, not because it does not hurt, not because he has some supernatural capacity for pain that you and I do not possess. He gets up because he has made the one decision that the four fears cannot survive, the decision that the next step matters more than the last fall. David Goggins wrote in Can't Hurt Me. When your mind is telling you you're done, you're really only 40% done. The 40% rule. The principle that your first threshold of exhaustion, the point where everything inside you is saying stop, is not the actual limit of what you can do. It is the first false ceiling, the one your fear built to protect you from the discomfort of discovering what lies beyond it. On those stairs, in the dark, bleeding, John Wick moves through that ceiling, and then he moves through the next one, and the next, because the ceiling is not real. It was never real. It was only fear wearing the face of physical fact. He sits, for the first time in 4 films, for the first time since Helen died, and Iosef broke into the house, and the puppy was killed, and the world he tried to build was dismantled piece by piece. John Wick is still, not frozen, not waiting for the next threat, not managing the perimeter of what he might lose. Still, the way you can only be still when you're not afraid anymore. The duel is done. The Marquise is dead. The debt is cleared. The Harbinger declared it in front of witnesses under the oldest rules the High Table possesses. John Wick is free. And the word free, what it actually means in the context of everything this story has been about, is this. He is no longer being operated by invisible forces, not by grief masquerading as paralysis, not by the fear of visibility that kept him buried in a quiet house. not by the terror of starting over that made him pour concrete over the truest version of himself, not by the internal narrator that tried, after every betrayal and fall and loss, to convince him that the evidence was pointing at something permanent and essential about who he was. He is free of the 4 fears, not because the fears were defeated in combat, but because he moved through them again and again in each film until the movement itself became the answer, until the body that kept getting up from the floor and the stairs and the ground after the fall learned at a cellular level that falling is not the same as being finished. The first response to stepping outside our comfort zone shows up as fear, fight or flight, racing thoughts, tight muscles, or the sudden urge to avoid the challenge completely. This response isn't weakness, it's brain science. Brain science, not a character flaw, not a personal failing, not evidence that you are the problem. The automatic output of a survival system that has not yet updated its threat database to include the specific territory you are now trying to move through. And you can update it, not by thinking your way through the fear, by moving through it, by doing the thing, the specific, concrete, physical next thing that the fear is trying to prevent. One time, then again, until the amygdala registers that the threat it was protecting you from was not a threat at all, until the neural pathway between intention and action is strong enough that the fear no longer gets the deciding vote. His headstone says his name, next to hers, not the boogeyman, not the most dangerous man alive, not the sum of everything he survived or everything he destroyed or every impossible thing he accomplished across 4 films of extraordinary, operatic, bone-cracking effort, just a name, next to the name of the person he loved. And that is the final lesson that the 4 fears, the fear of loss, the fear of being seen, the fear of starting over, the fear of being the problem, were keeping him from. Not the kills, not the legend, not the freedom even in the technical sense of the High Tables Declaration, the ability to be fully present for the people and the work and the life that are actually his, without the glass between himself and what he loves, without the constant management of how he appears and what he might lose and whether he can afford to begin again and whether the problem is ultimately, secretly, him. Those 4 fears were not protecting him, they were preventing him. And here is what I want you to take from this video, not as a quote, not as a lesson you can apply in theory, but as something you have now watched play out across 4 films in one of the most viscerally felt story arcs in modern cinema. The fears are not evidence of weakness. They are evidence that something matters to you. The fear of loss means you have something worth protecting. The fear of being seen means you have something worth showing. The fear of starting over means you have already built something worth the experience. The fear that you are the problem means you care enough about the outcome to take responsibility for it. They are not your enemies. They are misdirected energy. And the difference between the version of you that is stuck and the version of you that is moving is not the absence of those fears. It is the decision made again and again in the dark and on the stairs and in the basement and in the desert to move through them anyway, to break the concrete, to walk out of the burning house, to get up. One more time. The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker, The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks, Daring Greatly by Brene Brown, The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. 4 books, decades of research, and one franchise that put every single page of it into motion without once calling it psychology. 4 hidden fears, 1 story, and now your story. Subscribe to this channel if you need more of this. Share this with one person who has been stuck longer than they deserve to be, and leave a comment below. Tell me which of the 4 fears is yours, the one that hit when you were watching this, the one you recognized in yourself. I read every single one, and I will see you in the next video.